Cool, the next style we'll talk about, that comes on the heels of bebop, is more like it sounds, relaxed. It's more laid back. It's calm. It tends to be softer. The examples I'll play for you, almost always the drummer will be playing brushes. Brushes are these kind of wire things instead of the sticks. So the drummer is kind of more in the background, not so much in the foreground. You don't hear they'll do the dropping bombs thing, but they're very small little, more like hiccups. You know, it's not like bam, boom, crash. It's like boom, bam. It's more like a tea kettle or something, or a coffee pot, percolating. It's more of a percolating thing instead of bombs dropping. There's more improvisation, more written stuff. Sorry, not improvisation. Let me go over here to our handbook. Right after bebop is the cool style. And there tends to be softer dynamics, mellower playing. It's more melodic. They tend to play more melodies that you can kind of hum to yourself or sing. They start to use unusual instruments in the cool period. You start to get the flute, the oboe starts to make an appearance, kind of string instruments you usually didn't see. The harp. There was a lady named Dorothy Ashby who played jazz harp doing this during this period. And this is music that you see a lot. Anytime you watch a movie from the 1950s, I was watching L.A. Confidential, which is not from the 50s, but it was about the 1950s today. And they even had, in the background in one scene, they had a Jerry Mulligan, Chet Baker. They were kind of playing for a political rally. And they had these guys that were supposed to be Chet Baker and Jerry Mulligan, because it was right in that period. It was like in the mid-1950s or so. And Mulligan was very popular in Los Angeles. All the movie stars came to hear him play at a hotel called The Hague. And so there's a lot of mostly white musicians that are associated with cool. There's another terminology they use sometimes, West Coast jazz. And some of the West Coast jazz is considered cool jazz. I mean, it's not exclusively that. Cool and hot really exist from the 1920s, because you have Louis Armstrong, who's playing very loud, he's very boisterous, gregarious. It's an outgoing kind of playing. It's very extroverted. And he's a hot stylist. Most of the early jazz players were that way, except for one guy named Bix Beiderbecke, who came from Davenport, Iowa. He was a white musician, and he played very relaxed and very cool. And he was really the earliest of the cool style players, and this is like in the 1920s. We don't actually get a style called cool until 1950, but this kind of aesthetic has been around the entire time. There's always been a yin and a yang, sort of a hot and a cool, and it's usually your personality. You're either an extrovert, more of a hot style player, or an introvert, more introspective. Sometimes the cool style was labeled as being intellectual, or being cold, or being cerebral, or something. And some of these musicians, it did have more of a kind of, a cool feel to it. It had a more laid back and kind of, and a lot of the actors during this period, you had the same thing happen with James Dean and all of that, the beat poetry and stuff. It all kind of goes hand in hand. What happened is cool became more and more about white musicians, dominated by white musicians, getting a lot of press, and also getting good record deals, being featured on Columbia Records. That's Dave Brubeck had a very lucrative record deal at the time. But we also have guys like Miles Davis. Miles Davis is a black musician, but he really starts the cool movement in 1949. So it's not exclusively a black and white matter, but because you'll have guys like Lester Young from the swing era, who is very much a cool style player. And I'm going to bring in a tenor sax later in the semester, and I'll demonstrate hot and cool styles for you, both with Louis and Bix and with Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins. It keeps progressing through the decades, and then we finally get the 1950s where there's an actual style that emerges, where almost all the sax players are listening to Lester Young. They're listening to the cool style players. So all the people that are listed here, Miles Davis is kind of considered the main instigator of the style, the guy that kind of does this recording called Birth of the Cool in 1949 that sort of launches that particular style. They do start to use, you're going to hear in this example, the video I'm going to play for you, they do collective improvisation, but it's a much kindler, gentler version. It's not that kind of chaotic, all hell breaking loose, front line kind of Mardi Gras type of Bourbon Street thing that you heard with the front line in New Orleans, where the trumpet and the trombone and the clarinet are all kind of going for it. It's more space and kind of softer, and there's kind of a weaving going on. It has almost a classical feel to it. A lot of people compared Jerry Mulligan's music to Bach, in that it sounded like two-part inventions or like fugues, because he had an unusual group. He had a group with just a bass player, a drummer, and then himself on baritone sax, and usually a trumpet player. And this example I'm going to play for you, it's a trombonist, two horns, That's it. No piano player, no guitar. There's no chord instrument. So it's a very thin texture, just like it says on your listening guide. It tends to be kind of more space. It's a little airier kind of sounding. Softer dynamics. They tended to use, they rehearsed much more. Both the cool musicians and the hard bop musicians that came out of bebop, they were much more professional in their presentation. They would wear matching blazers, or they'd have uniforms. They would have stable personnel in the group from gig to gig, from recording to recording, where you wouldn't just have this rotating cast of people playing like Charlie Parker did so often. So they would rehearse music, and they would have music that they would write, original pieces, and there would be little stops and starts, and it sounded more polished in its presentation. So the example I'm going to play for you of the cool is Jerry Mulligan and his quartet, and he's one of the kind of quintessential cool players. He started on the East Coast, but he eventually migrated over to Los Angeles. He ends up in Los Angeles in the late 50s and forms a group with a trumpet player named Chet Baker. And this is one of his later groups that Chet and he didn't get along so well. So Chet had left the group, and he's playing with a trombone player on this example. And this would be a real good example of a cool style. This would be one I could play for you as an example, because the drums are going to be playing brushes. It's going to be very soft sounding. So here we go. Jerry Mulligan. I'm going to need the computer on there. That's the baritone sax. Big giant saxophone there. But even that big bass range saxophone, he plays a very light, airy kind of approach to it, which is typical of the cool guys. In fact, right here, little stops and starts. This is very rehearsed sounding. Obviously, they've run through this before. What you hear in the background is the drums playing brushes, not sticks. Bass player's playing 2-beat right now. Boom, 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 boom. Kind of that gate. Now this is something that you see with the cool period you don't really see with the other styles. He's playing the solo. He's accompanying him. He's playing really soft and thinking up something to play along with him. So the trombonist is supporting. They're both playing at the same time. That never happens in bebop. It's always one solo at a time. Usually much faster. It's very soft, kind of more mellow, just like it sounds. Cool, right? This trombone's a little different too. This is a valve trombone. The slide doesn't move, it's fixed. So he has pistons, and he's playing like a trumpet. It allows you to play a little faster on the trombone. So this kind of weaving back and forth is going to change in a second. The trombonist, Bob Brickmeyer, he's going to play the solo. The saxophonist will accompany him. So now he drops back. So even though it's the trombonist solo, the baritone's playing a little behind him. Now I do a lot of this on our Thursday Java sessions, where I'll play little background things while the bass player's playing a solo. I'm not really soloing, neither is he. He's not really soloing now, he's accompanying him. But it's still improvised. He's still making all that stuff up. If they show a shot of the drummer, you'll see the brushes. You can hear the that's a hi-hat closing on 2 and 4, like I talked about last week, syncopation. Almost all the swing styles, big band styles, hi-hat closes on 2 and 4. Now there's going to be a bass solo where it's going to get really quiet. There's the drums, you can see them a little bit there. So there's a bass solo, and these guys are playing a very simple little riff behind them, which they probably just came up with. We do that at Pandora's a lot of times at the jam sessions. We'll just say, here's the riff, play a background figure. Here it is. Find a note to play on it. Now there's a drummer, you can kind of see him now. Hi-hat, ride cymbal, and he's using brushes. So it makes it very soft and kind of more in the background. So now the bass player's playing a solo, and they're kind of trying to stay underneath by playing long, sustained notes. Here's the little riff. riff is a simple repeated idea. Again. Simple little idea that you just can pick up by ear real quick. Now what they're doing right now is actually called double time. They're playing twice as fast. The tempo was that fast before. But even as they're playing fast, it's not really that, aggressive. Drummer's playing sticks. He's playing kind of light. He's not playing a lot of big dropping bombs and stuff like that. Here it goes back. Boom, 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 boom. We're going to be down here in a second. Yep, there they just kind of faded out on those guys at the very end. So in that example, almost all the stuff that we're talking about with Cool, the brushes are being used by the drummer, and both of the horns are kind of weaving in and out. That's real typical in Cool. I'll usually pick an example of that, where you can hear both the horns kind of back and forth. It tends to be quite a bit softer. Even when they're playing that up-tempo thing toward the end, it doesn't have that driving kind of heat or fire to it that you have with the bebop style. And they also do have more of a kind of composed way of putting the music together, presenting it. They all have those snappy seersucker blazers they were wearing, right? You never get that with the bebop musicians, that much of a professional presentation from those particular musicians. Now, there's a lot of different styles that start to emerge. The 50s is the most creative period for jazz because there's sort of this fragmentation that happens with all these different styles. There's other ones I'm not really going to go into tonight. There's a style called Bossa Nova that happens a little bit later, and it's Brazilian music and jazz. And it's featured in almost all the James Bond movies. You see it all the time in like these kind of early 1960s movies and a lot of the television shows. The Bossa Nova is a very subtle, it's also like Cool, very much in the background type of music. There's another style called third stream that combines classical music and jazz, and a lot of soundtracks are third stream soundtracks. There was a movie a few years ago, there's a lot of them though, but Catch Me If You Can with Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio. That had a third stream, jazz and classical, kind of an orchestra, kind of trying to play in a jazz manner. And almost all the Alfred Hitchcock movies. Bernard Herrmann, he used to write these kind of jazz scores. It was jazz and also using orchestra. And so that's an offshoot of Cool, where they're consciously trying to put together symphony orchestra type of music, classical music, and jazz. And what happens with Cool is it becomes more and more about European music and white musicians as it kind of gains its popularity, and it creates some friction, within the jazz community, especially from the black musicians.